So hello everyone, our today's topic is the vertebral canal and its content. So let us begin by understanding what the vertebral canal is. So when the vertebrae they are aligned in specific sequence, they create a continuous passage. So this passage uh, is known as vertebral canal. So now this canal, remember, it is a protective housing for crucial elements of the nervous system. Now let us discuss what are the components of this vertebral canal. Let us dissect the contents of the vertebral canal. Now the canal, remember, it contains three layers of protective membrane. What are those? They are known as meninges. So these meninges, remember, they act as like a safeguard, the delicate safeguard for the delicate structures like the spinal cord and its extension. Now within the vertebral canal, we find is dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater. So these are collectively known as meninges. So what are their function? These layers would create space that serve various functions like providing cushioning and protecting the spinal cord. Now the vertebral canal, it is bounded, remember, anteriorly by the vertebral bodies and the intervertebral disc, each covered by posterior longitudinal ligament. Posteriorly there is lamina, ligament flava. Now what are the contents? What are the contents of the vertebral canal? As we travel deeper into the vertebral canal, we encounter the spinal cord. That is a crucial part of our central nervous system. Additionally, there is chorda equina, a bundle of the nerve roots that extend beyond the spinal cord, providing sensory and the motor function to the lower limbs. Apart from that, there is intervertebral foramen. So what are those intervertebral foramen? These are like pairs of opening that is located between the bony structures on the back side of one vertebra and front side of vertebra next to it. So imagine them like a small tunnels or passage. Within these openings there are network of structures. We have dorsal and ventral roots, which are like the starting points or the roots of the nerve. So these roots would together form the trunk, like a main path in our tunnel. So from these trunks, smaller branches called primary rami branches, they reaches the different part of the body. Now the vertebral canal, what are the contents of the vertebral canal? From the outward side, these are the contents. We have the epidural or extradural space, then dura mater, then subdural space, then delicate arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space, and last is the firm pia mater. The first is the epidural space. So the first layer we encounter in the epidural is the epidural space. So the first layer we encounter is the epidural space. Now this space, remember, it is present, it lies outside the dura mater. So this one is the dura mater, and this epidural space, it lies here. So it lies outside the dura mater, and it is filled with fat, loose areolar connective tissue, and the blood vessels. So these will act as protective cushion for spinal cords and its surrounding structure. Now the loose areolar tissue, it will provide a cushioning effect and support the structure within the space. The fat, that will provide additional protection and insulation. The spinal arteries, they are on way to supply the deeper content within the vertebral canal, whereas the intervertebral venous plexus, that is the collection of the veins the network of veins responsible for draining the venous blood from the spinal cord. Now, what is the role of the spinal arteries? Remember, spinal arteries, they originate from different sources at different level. They enter the vertebral canal through the foramen, that is intervertebral foramen, and they help in supplying the spinal cord, spinal nerve roots, meninges, and ligaments, etc. Moving to the inward, we encounter is the thick dura mater. So this dura mater would, what is the function of the dura mater? It is protective, means it will provide a protective covering for the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord, and this dura mater would provide a protective covering. So it will give strength and support to the spinal cord. The spinal dura mater, it is thick, tough membrane forming loose sheath around the spinal cord. Now remember, what is the extent of spinal dura mater? It lies from the foramen magnum to lower border of the second sacral vertebra. Beneath the dura mater, you will see is the subdural space. So this space, it contains capillaries and small amount of fluid that would provide protection and lubrication to the spinal cord. Now the subdural space, it contains a thin layer of serous fluid that would permit the movement of dura mater over the arachnoid. The next structure is the delicate arachnoid matter. The arachnoid matter, it is thin transparent membrane that loosely envelops the entire central nervous system. So the subarachnoid space, it is wide space that is present between the pia mater and the arachnoid, and that space, it is filled with, remember, cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal subarachnoid space, it is wider than the space around the brain, and it is widest below the level of the spinal cord. Remember that. Now you have to remember for your exam point, that is the lumbar puncture. Lumbar puncture, remember, it is a medical procedure, and it is performed to obtain a sample of cerebrospinal fluid. Now this fluid, it is conducted in the lower and the widest part of the spinal subarachnoid space, generally between the third and the fourth lumbar vertebra. So this needle, the needle is inserted here. So lumbar puncture, that is also known as spinal tap. So it is a medical procedure that involves the insertion of thin needle into the subarachnoid space in the lumbar region of the spine. So the subarachnoid space, it is a cavity between the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater, that are the layer of the meninges that surround it, the spinal cord and the brain. Now the primary, what is the purpose of this lumbar puncture? To collect the cerebrospinal fluid. So analysis of this fluid can help you to provide the diagnose the conditions like bleeding, inflammation, or some neurological conditions. Apart from that, lumbar puncture can be used to measure the intracranial pressure, that is pressure within the skull. If there is increased intracranial pressure that occurs due to conditions in hydrocephalus, brain tumors, so monitoring the pressure is important in managing these neurological disorders. So in some cases, the lumbar puncture may be performed to relieve this excessive intracranial pressure by removing the excess CSF fluid. The next layer is the firm pia mater. So moving close to the center, we encounter the firm pia mater, the innermost layer, adhere closely to the surface of the spinal cord that would provide the support and the nourishment. And remember that together the arachnoid and pyometer, they form the leptomeninges. The spinal pyometer, it consists of two layers: outer epipya containing large vessels and inner pyaglia which is in contact with the nervous tissue. Now the pyometer, it invests the spinal cord and continues below it as final terminate. So final film terminate, it is a delicate membrane like structure within the spinal cord. It is a part of, remember, it is a part of pyometer. It extends from the conus medullaris, which is the tapered lower end of the spinal cord, and it descends within the spinal canal. Now there are two parts of filum terminal. One is the filum terminal internum, and other is the externum. The lower, longest part of filum terminal is the externum, and it continues from the second sacral vertebra to the tailbone. So what is the role of this filum terminal? It plays a role in stabilizing the spinal cord within the spinal canal, preventing the excessive movement. And it helps to anchor the spinal cord to the coccyx. And important clinical consideration related to filum terminal, remember, is its tethered cord syndrome. So it occurs when the final terminal is abnormally attached to the lower end of spinal cord, limiting the movement of spinal cord. Additional structures that could be present are the linea splenidense, that is a medial longitudinal glistening bands that is formed by a thickening of pyometer at the mouth of anterior midden fissure of the spinal cord. What is ligamentum denticulatum? So these are ribbon-like thickened bands of pyometer piercing the arachnoid and attached to the inner surface of the dura mater. So what is linea splendens? It refers to median longitudinal glistening band formed by thickening of pyometer at the anterior midden fissure of the spinal cord. So the anterior midden fissure, it is a groove on the frontal surface of the spinal cord. The thickening of pyometer in this location from a glistening band. Other is a ligamentum denticulatum, a narrow vertical ridge between the ventral and dorsal nerve roots that consist of tooth-like processes. So these tooth-like processes, they are ligamentum denticulatum. The first teeth of denticulatum lies at level of foramen magnum, the last between T12 and L1. Next is what is coda equina. At the core of the vertebral canal, we find spinal cord or spinal medulla. That is the vital part of the central nervous system. So we have the end of spinal cord, we have structure that is known as coda equina. That it resembles just like a horse tail. Other is the conus medullaris. The terminal end of spinal cord is the conus medullaris. In adult, it is at L1 segment, and in children, it lies at L3 segment. Another thing is leptomeningitis. What is that? So it is the inflammation that occurs due to the infection of leptomeninges, especially the pyometer and arachnoid matter. So the cause of that are TB or any pyogenic infection. The patient would have fever, headache, neck rigidity, convulsions. There would be changes in CSF, like there would be elevated intracranial pressure, there would be increased proteins, cell count, decreased sugar and chloride levels. Now the lumbar puncture in the adult, remember, the local anesthesia is, the puncture site is between L3 and L4 segment. So the needle, what would be the needle path? The needle would pass through skin, fat, ligament, epidural space, dura, arachnoid, and last is the subarachnoid space to release this CSF. So this is the needle pathway is important for your exam point of view. It has been asked many a times in exam. The lumbar puncture in infant, it is performed during the second month of life when the spinal cord usually reaches the L3 level. The needle introduction is done between the L4 and L5 within the infant in flexed position. Other we can do is cisternal puncture. So in the cisternal puncture, the needle, it is inserted into one of the CSF filled cistern located around the brain. Commonly cisterns include the cerebromedullary cistern, pontine cistern, etc. The procedure often involves access through the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane, whereas the lumbar puncture involves the insertion of needle into the subarachnoid space in the lumbar region of the spine. That is what you have to remember. In the cisternal puncture, the needle is aimed at specific cistern around the brain, and the CSF is collected from this region. Whereas in lumbar puncture, the needle is inserted into the subarachnoid space of the lumbar spine, and CSF is collected from the lower region. The cisternal puncture is more complex and riskier procedure as compared to the lumbar puncture. Next are the spinal nerves. The spinal cord gives rise to 31 pair of the spinal nerves. 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal. So total of 31 pairs. So each nerve is attached to spinal cord by two roots. One is the ventral motor root and other is a dorsal sensory root. And each dorsal root bears a ganglion. So the uppermost nerve root passes horizontally from the spinal cord to reach the intervertebral foramen. Now let us discuss about the vertebral canal compression. So the clinical implications that are associated with compression of the vertebral canal. Compression of the spinal cord by tumor can lead to neurological consequences, like there could be paraplegia, or the severity of paralysis. It is determined by location and extent of the compression. What are the type of spinal tumors? The spinal tumors, they may originate from various tissues within the spinal cord. If they originate from dura mater, they are known as meningioma, glial cells, glioma, nerve cells, neurofibroma, ependymal cells, ependyoma, etc. The tumor, they do not obstruct the spinal cord, but they can also obstruct the subarachnoid space. So this obstruction can result in a low cerebrospinal fluid pressure within the lesion, leading to what is known as Freund syndrome. So that is characterized by yellowish discharge of CSF below the level of obstruction. There would be elevated protein level and normal cell content. Now the spinal block and compression, it can be confirmed through the diagnostic methods like myelography, CT scan, or the MRI technique. Compression of the cauda equina, it can lead to cauda equina syndrome. There may be prolapse of the intervertebral disc. There may be presence of osteophytes, etc. So the compression that would lead to shooting pain around the distribution of the affected nerves. The next part is the spinal cord termination. The spinal cord in adult, the spinal cord, it terminates, remember, at the lower part of the first lumbar vertebra. And the spinal dura mater and arachnoid mater, they extend till the second sacral vertebra. So these are things that you have to remember for your entrance point of view.